Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen, and I'm the curator of the Arctic Voices Gallery at Science World, British Columbia. This is the first of the virtual discussions we'll be having here at Science World, where we'll be learning from different scientists and researchers about the Arctic. Before we begin, I'd like to gratefully acknowledge that Science World is located in the traditional unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh village of Swinak. I'm currently presenting in Burnaby. Burnaby is on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Hunkelmanum and Squamish-speaking peoples. This presentation will be a recorded webinar format, so you can safely keep your cameras and microphones off. Feel free to interact with us by adding questions and comments about things you're enjoying in the presentation in the chat. We ask that you keep comments relevant to what is being discussed and leave space for everyone to participate. We have Brian as our tech support, and he'll be kind of monitoring the chat throughout our presentation. Now to begin, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Philippe Tortell. He's a professor of oceanography at UBC and the head of Department of the Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. Welcome, Philippe.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks, Brian. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm very pleased to be here to give you a little bit of information about the way that scientists work in the Arctic, the kinds of questions that we ask, and the sort of tools that we use to answer those questions. I'm going to share a few slides with you and show you some pictures and videos, and hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of what it is that we do and what we can do in understanding the Arctic from a scientific perspective. I wasn't sure what kind of audience we were going to have, if we have a bunch of kids and adults and stuff. So I've kind of aimed it at an audience of curious kids and curious adults. So I'll keep it pretty light and bright without too much technical detail, but there'll be time at the end for lots of questions if people want to get into more of some of the details. So I will start sharing my screen now, and I'll just start. There we go. Looking good, Brian? See that well? Okay, I should also say too that I'm gonna ask some questions, and I'd be really happy for comments, but I'm not very good at multitasking, so I'm going to rely on Brian to unmute every now and then and help me out. All right, so this is, as I say, the first of the series of Arctic Voices, and I'm calling it a scientist's view of the Arctic. And the main question that I want to ask and discuss with you is to understand better how the Arctic Ocean is changing and how those changes are going to affect the people who live there, and in fact, how they're going to affect us as well. I think many of you know, but for those of you who don't know, the Arctic regions are the parts of the world that are warming the fastest. Everybody now knows that the world is getting warmer through global warming, but that warming is particularly strong in the Arctic. This is a graph that shows the change of temperature over the last number of decades in different parts of the world. The land is a little bit hard to see, but this is North America. This is Alaska here that I'm outlining. We're down here in Vancouver, if you are listening from Vancouver. And you can see that the colors go from low temperature changes, in fact, sometimes even negative changes, some cooling trends, towards positive trends. So the big red blob here that sits over the North Pole, right in the middle, indicates that the Arctic is warming faster than any other region in the world. As scientists, we're really interested in understanding what that warming means for the Arctic system. But because the Arctic is large and it's really remote, it's often hard for us to get there to actually make measurements on the ground, so to speak. So increasingly, we rely on pretty sophisticated technologies like the satellites that are shown here that get shot up into space on rockets, and they orbit Earth, collecting all kinds of information and taking pictures and gathering images of the Earth that give us really important information about how that warming is affecting the Arctic. The first video I'm going to show you is a video that I put together from a whole series of satellite pictures of the Earth. So this little cross here in the middle again is the North Pole. This is North America. Here's Alaska. This is Russia and Siberia. And what I'm going to show you is an animation. I'll just start it now. Every single different frame is a picture from a different day. So we're into February. You can see 26. We're now into March. And the white colors here represent sea ice, and the blue represents ocean that doesn't have ice. And as you see, the ice is sort of moving around because some of it's melting and the winds are pushing it around. And as we get into July, and now we're into August and into September, you can see that that ice melts back every year in the summertime. And now as we go back into the fall, we're in October now, and now November, and soon in December, you can see that that ice grows back. So it shrinks in the summertime because of warming, and it grows back naturally as we go into fall and winter. That is a cycle that's repeated each and every single year. Oops. At the same time, we know that there are changes from year to year. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you a satellite image compiled from September of 1994. September is a time of the year when there's typically the lowest extent of sea ice. Most of the sea ice is melted back during the late summer. And on the left, I'm showing you also a September image from 2016. And what you can see here is this large difference between 1984 on the left and 2016. So the amount of ice that's left at the end of the summer, or what we would call the sea ice minimum, is significantly lower over the last, it's been significantly decreased over the last number of decades. So we are seeing a strong effect of this warming on decreased sea ice cover in the Arctic. And I'm sure that many of you will know that the decrease in sea ice has important implications for both the ecosystem and animals, and also for humans. On the left, I have a picture here of polar bears that are sitting on this little floe of ice. And for those who don't know, the hunting success of polar bears depends very much on the presence of sea ice, because that is where they are hunting for a lot of their seals. And in the absence of sea ice, they're spending a lot more of their time in the water, swimming around, and spending a lot of energy. At the same time, travel of humans and sleds and snowmobiles and all those sorts of things on the landscape is becoming increasingly difficult as more and more of that ice melts. You can think about the winter ice and the summer ice as essentially a highway for travel of humans across the landscape. And when that ice melts back, you can see the kinds of challenges that result. But from the perspective of a marine scientist, the ice also has other implications. This is a little cartoon showing you a schematic of the Arctic food web. There's humans, of course, that are part of it, polar bears, seals, seabirds, and so on. Most of these animals live on or near the surface, but underneath that surface, underneath the ice and in the water, there's a whole other ecosystem that exists. And it's a complicated ecosystem that involves many different organisms. The base of that food chain, at the bottom of the food chain, are these organisms here that we call phytoplankton. These phytoplankton are single-celled organisms. They're microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye. You need a microscope. And they are basically producing the energy that supports everything else in this ecosystem. And as an oceanographer, we're really interested in understanding what affects the growth of these phytoplankton. So I'll show you a beautiful image of a sample of plankton in water. And here I'm showing you both animals, like this one right here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is a copepod. There's another one here and another one here. There's a whole bunch of these animals called copepods. And then these smaller things here, these sort of golden little jewels here and all throughout and here, these are phytoplankton. They're these little microscopic photosynthetic organisms. Now, maybe you've never seen plankton before, but some of you will know about plankton from SpongeBob, if you watch SpongeBob. So this is plankton. I guess he's supposed to be an evil copepod. He looks kind of like this thing, I think. So what is it that we want to know about plankton, and how is it that we can actually get that information? Well, plankton in the oceans are in many ways exactly like the plants that we know on land. All plants get their energy from sunlight through the leaves, and they produce oxygen in photosynthesis. They give off oxygen. Here's a molecule of oxygen with two atoms of oxygen bound together. And at the same time, plants take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they produce sugars. And in addition to sunlight, what they also need is water and minerals. You can think about those minerals like the fertilizer maybe that you put into your garden at home. And in oceanography, we can measure the process of photosynthesis by measuring a bunch of different things. We can measure the light energy that's available in the water. We can measure the oxygen that's being produced. We can measure the carbon dioxide that's being removed. And we can measure the concentration of the different minerals that are supporting photosynthesis by the plankton. And how we actually do that is not with satellites. Satellites are not going to enable us to measure all of these different things. So for that, we need to look into other aspects of the water. This is a little bit of a complicated cartoon, but I want to show it to you to make the point that when we look at the water in the Arctic Ocean, it's not just one kind of water. There are different kinds of water. And for an analogy, you can think about this like the oil and vinegar salad dressing that maybe you've seen at home, where you've got these two different layers of water that have what we call different densities. This would be the vinegary, watery layer, and this is the oil layer. They have these different densities and they separate out naturally. And the same is true in the Arctic Ocean, where we have water masses that come from the Atlantic Ocean at different places. We have waters that come from the Pacific Ocean. And we have this layering of these different water masses that we can distinguish by measuring their temperatures and their salt content and their nutrient content. To give you one final analogy, it's really not so different from just looking at a beautiful layer cake, where we could think about each of these layers of cake as being a different layer of ocean water that will have different amounts of salts and different temperatures and nutrients and so on. So it's really important for us to measure these things. And satellites don't really allow us to measure anything other than the surface. So if I was measuring this cake from a satellite, all I would see was this top layer. These deeper layers would be hidden from us. So what that means is that we need to find another way to sample the ocean properties in the Arctic. And we do that using ships. Now, I don't know how many people carry a lot of cash around in their wallets these days. Mostly we do things with credit cards and debit cards. But those of you who do carry cash, you know, at some point in this presentation or maybe afterwards, go and see if you can get your hands on a $50 bill. If you do that and you get our kids, ask your parents to give you a $50 bill, they'll probably want you to give it back to them after, but have a look at it. And you will see that on the back of that $50 bill is a picture of this research vessel. It's called the Amundsen. Raoul Amundsen was an explorer who made it to the South Pole. And in Canada, we have a Coast Guard research ship, which is named after Amundsen. And that's a really important vessel for oceanographers to conduct research in the Arctic. It's a specially designed ship that allows us to move through water that has ice. It's an icebreaker, so we can actually break through the ice using this ship. And inside of the ship, scientists like this fellow Robert Isaac, who's a student of mine at the University of British Columbia, will put together a complicated set of instrumentation that we can use to measure some of these properties of the ocean water, things like temperature and salt content. And this particular set of images I'm showing you here is a system that we have built to measure the oxygen concentration in water. And remember that by measuring oxygen in water, we can get information about the amount of photosynthesis that's happening. It gives us some information about the activity of the plants in the water, which is, of course, going to be important for the rest of the marine ecosystem. I'll let you think about why Robert might have a can of ginger ale and a box of goldfish. And I'll give you a hint that Robert gets pretty seasick when he goes on these boats. Sometimes they move around a lot. And it turns out that goldfish and ginger ale is a pretty good remedy for seasickness.
Philippe, there's a few questions that have come up in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
Someone was wondering how many people live up in the Arctic areas?
How many people live in the Arctic areas?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would guess it's probably something on the order of about maybe 10,000 people at most. You know, typically the small communities there, like Joe Haven or Kugluktuk, may have a few hundred permanent residents. And, you know, summing that across all the vast space, it's probably an order of maybe 10,000, I would guess, at most.
Okay. There was a question about the layers, the layer cake and the layers of water there. Just wondering, the temperature and salinity, is that really drastic enough to separate the distinct layers of water?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is indeed.
And another, it's kind of a bigger question, but what things can everyday people do to help the Arctic ecosystem?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things that we can do, and maybe I'd like to talk about that a little bit at the end. That's a really great question, but it's a complicated question. So maybe we could talk about that in more of a discussion at the end. So let's come back to that maybe.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anything else, Brian?
Nope, that's all for now.
All right. So yeah, please, that was great. Please continue to interrupt. So here's Robert with his scientific instruments and his seasickness supplies all ready to go. And this is the kind of work that we do in my group at UBC to measure properties of the Arctic Ocean. We have also done experiments where we collect seawater in bottles and we do experiments. So this is Clara Hope. She was a postdoctoral fellow with us a number of years ago, and she's standing in front of these two plexiglass tanks. And it's not really easy to see, but inside of these tanks, there's a whole bunch of different plastic bottles. And inside the bottles, we have seawater, and we are controlling the temperature and the light and the amount of carbon dioxide in the seawater. That's what all these little tubes are, so we can bubble gases with different amounts of carbon dioxide to test some ideas and some hypotheses about how environmental conditions affect the phytoplankton in the bottle. So we can make measurements, but we can also do experiments where we change things and we see what happens. So how do we actually collect seawater in the Arctic? Well, we need to go on a ship, as I've said, but we can't just sort of hang over the side with a little bucket. Well, we could actually, but a bucket isn't really going to get us all that far. So we have specialized equipment that you can see here that we use to collect seawater. So this is a time-lapse video of some scientists on the Amundsen who are preparing a series of these bottles. So there's that white thing is like a big metal frame, and there's all of these bottles that are getting strapped onto the frame. And as you'll see in the next video, those bottles are going to go over the side of the ship. So these bottles are now lifted from a crane. They're going over the side of the ship. That's Jay Cullen. He's a professor at the University of Victoria. Beautiful GoPro on here. And you can see that the bottles are now going into the water, splash. There they go. And the bottles get lowered down so we could sample these different layers. Now there's a real treat coming here because you're going to see some animals. Maybe you can see that little black thing moving around. There's another one, little flying thing. These are called pteropods. These are marine snails with little beautiful wings. And you can see them. There's going to be a whole bunch more coming. And you know, it's just luck here. There's another beautiful one here, another one there. And so these bottles would get lowered down to a depth in the water column down to a few thousand meters if we want to. And from a computer in the ship's laboratory, we can decide when we want to close the bottles. So they go down open, they fill up with water. And when we want to collect water at a particular depth, we just hit a button on a computer and the bottles will close. So you're going to see that in just, I'll go back and see it. So keep your eyes on this bottle right here. And in a second, you're going to see it close automatically. There it goes. Hopefully you caught that. And then when we bring that bottle back up to the surface, we have collected water from that particular depth of interest. So now the bottles are coming back. This was a very short little test deployment, but typically we would go down thousands of meters below the surface. So the bottles come back up onto the surface and we bring them onto the laboratories in the ship, and we can collect that water and make measurements of chemistry and biology. This is quite nice because the bottles do a little rotation and you can see a little bit about the ship. Now, in addition to collecting water from ships, sometimes we need to look at things other than the ocean water itself. And this is a picture that Robert took. Robert is the student who had that ginger ale and the goldfish. He took this picture with me from a helicopter of a river. And what's important about this picture is off on the left here, you can see all of this dirt and all of this sediment, which is coming from the river into the Arctic Ocean. And here you can see little bits of ice. And perhaps you can see on the left this brownish, dark green material. All of this is material that's coming from the river into the ocean. And it turns out to be a really important source of nutrients and salts, nutrients in particular, for the ocean. So if we want to understand the ocean, we don't just sample the ocean, we also have to understand the rivers which are impacting the oceans in the Arctic. So to do that, we have the good fortune to be able to work from helicopters. So we leave the ship on a helicopter, and we are able to go and collect water from the rivers, so we can measure things like the nutrient concentrations and the gas concentrations in the water. This is a PhD student who was working with me. Her name is Christina Brown, and you can see her flying along with the helicopter pilot. And so they've identified a river that they want to sample. I'll maybe just jump ahead a little bit here. And so they're picking their landing spot. And I'll show you in a second what kind of work we're actually doing. So here they are, landing on the river. And once you find your spot, you land, and then you begin to collect water. So this is a different helicopter trip that I did with my student. So here's me and here's Robert. And we are, you can see, again, a time-lapse video. So the water is flowing. We have a long pole here and a tube connected to it. And we have a little pump that's drawing water from the river. And you can sort of see us here with syringes and filters filling up all of these different bottles. And so now this is at the end of the sampling. I'm putting everything away, and Robert is walking around just taking some pictures of the site so that we can understand a little bit more. So here I go. I just put the pump away. And that's the kind of river sampling that we do. And then I just put this one. Yes.
Yeah, there was a question when you're out doing a research trip on the boat. How long would you spend on the ship? How long does a typical trip take?
Yeah, up in the Arctic, it's sometimes between, I would say it's sometimes as long as 6 weeks, but usually anywhere between about 3 weeks and 6 weeks. So about 21 days to about 60 days.
Thank you.
And then I'll just show you, this is a nice little video because it shows the skill of the helicopter pilot. So this is after a river sampling trip. You can see that the ship is continuing to move through the water. And here comes the pilot who's going to land on the back of the ship, obviously very, very skillful. And that's what it looks like to come back onto the ship with all of our samples from the river. All right. Now, the other thing that we have to sample when we're working in the Arctic Ocean is not just the ocean itself and not just the rivers, but also the ice, the glaciers that cover much of Canada's Arctic. And here is a picture of a place called the Devon Ice Cap. It's on Devon Island in northeastern Arctic, not too far from Ellesmere Island, but a little bit further south of that. And all of this white that you can see is a glacier. And for those who don't know, glaciers are essentially very, very slow-moving rivers of ice. When ice accumulates on these mountains, eventually it flows down into the ocean. And when it interacts with the ocean, we have all of this material that comes from the glaciers into the ocean. And that includes not just melting ice, but all of the stuff underneath it, the sediment that is transported under the glacier impacts the ocean. It affects the ocean, and it provides a source of nutrients. So for that reason, it's important to understand what is going on with the sea ice. And this is a picture of two students from the University of Ottawa who are making measurements of the temperature of the ice and the thickness of the ice. And there are other measurements they make to look at how quickly the ice is moving. So that's another kind of work that we do. So what have we learned so far? I'm just checking my time here. Yeah, time. So I know I haven't really given you a lot of details. I've mostly told you about how it is that we approach scientifically answering some of these questions. And through the application of science, we've learned that the warming that we see in the Arctic is significantly affecting ice and leading to the melting of ice in the Arctic. And that melting of ice affects the amount of light and the amount of nutrients that are available for phytoplankton and for photosynthesis. And we know that, that these changes in sea ice and light and nutrients are affecting marine ecosystems and also the livelihoods of people in northern communities. Now, to come back a little bit to the question that someone posed, what is it that we can do to help offset some of these changes? It is a pretty tall order, but you know, many of the efforts now that Canada and other nations of the world that are involved in to slow global warming is going to be really important to slow, but certainly not stop these changes. A lot of these changes of warming and sea ice melt are going to continue well into the future, no matter what we do. We do, however, have a choice about limiting and slowing those changes. We know, however, that the environments are changing, and so scientific information becomes really important to help us better plan for the future. So we can't stop all of the changes, but we can at least have a better idea of what the future is going to hold. And with that, I want to end on a few thoughts around how we as scientists can work with people in communities. This is a picture of a hamlet called Kugluktuk, and it is perched here on the kind of the eastern part of what we call the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And it's a place where often the Coast Guard vessels will stop at the end of a trip to exchange personnel and equipment and so on. These communities are, on the one hand, the ones that are going to be most affected by the changes that we see in the Arctic. As the marine ecosystem evolves, those changes will impact the livelihoods of these people. At the same time, these communities have a long, many generations worth of knowledge, traditional knowledge about these ecosystems. They understand the land, they understand the marine ecosystems and the habits and distributions of the animals. And they therefore provide a really powerful source of information that is complementary to the kind of measurements that we make through our scientific instruments. And I have been involved in a project with a group called the Arctic Eider Society, who has developed a social media application called Siku. And you can think about Siku essentially as a version of a Facebook, if you will, for Inuit communities. And it allows them to exchange information and photographs from their day-to-day time on the land and their hunting, while at the same time accessing information about science from our measurements. And so here's an example of two individuals who have logged on to the Siku platform, and they're able to access information from different temperature and salinity and nutrient measurements that are being produced continuously, while at the same time accessing photographs and stories and information that's coming from the land, from those people who are out hunting and fishing and so on. And we've been involved in some workshops in the north where we have worked with people. This is in Johaven a couple of years ago, I guess 2.5 years ago now, where we took up a bunch of smartphones that were loaded with Siku, and we went out onto the ice to work with people from the community so that they were accessing satellite-based sea ice measurements, and they at the same time were on the ground making observations of sea ice thickness and distribution, and that information was really helpful to make sure that what the satellites were seeing was actually correct. And over here on the right-hand side, I'm showing you a picture of a workshop that we did where we had a map of a satellite observation of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a measure of plankton, phytoplankton abundance, and we were matching up what the satellite was seeing with these little candies that were monitoring what kind of fishing success people were having in different places. So again, we're taking the knowledge that comes from experience on the land and we're merging it with scientific observations to produce a better understanding of what is going on in the Arctic. And these human dimensions, I think, are really important. And I guess I'll conclude by saying that science has taught us a lot about the Arctic. And a big part of that is learning how to work with and in support of communities in the north, because we are sort of all in this together. And we really need to understand what's happening to the Arctic, and we need to think about the changes that are coming and what it is that we're going to need to do to adapt to minimize the harm that is coming to ecosystems and communities. So I'll stop right there. I think that's been about half an hour or so. It seems like we have some time now for questions and discussions.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I'm just watching the chat now, and we'll see as other questions come up. A comment here, just complimentary knowledge, really well said. The Indigenous knowledge keepers have generations of information to share, and it sounds like a really good relationship. I'd be curious, how do you go about building those relationships with the Indigenous people as ships showing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I learned pretty early on that these are relationships that take a long time to build. We have a long history of very bad relationships where, kind of what you were saying, Brian, people would just sort of show up in their ships and leave without really providing any kind of useful contact or engagement with communities. So the relationships really take a long time to develop. They need a lot of trust, and they have to be driven by the priorities of the communities. And so the approach that I've used is to work with organizations that have already put in a lot of time and many years into building those relationships. In particular, I've worked a lot with the Vancouver Aquarium. They have a program called Ikarvik, which is a program that's really focused on community-led initiatives, looking at how science can be used to support things that the communities really care about, whether it's food security or safety on the ice. These are workshops that have been run now for, I'm thinking, well over 15 years, where scientists go to the north and really go there for the purposes of listening to understand what people are concerned about and getting a better idea of how science can be used to help address some of these important community priorities. So that's a long way of saying that I've built relationships on top of those that already existed, and that was really helpful for me in having these connections made.
Someone was curious, what is the most fun part of your job?
I have to say that the helicopter trips and the river sampling is really, really fun. I do also really enjoy the opportunity to be on these ships where there might be 30 or 40 scientists from across Canada and maybe even around the world. And it's a really nice opportunity to meet some very interesting people.
How do you determine who goes on the trips? Which projects get chosen for each excursion?
Yeah, the projects are funded mostly by the Canadian government through various science agencies, and the money comes from scientific proposals that are written by teams of investigators. So typically there might be 10 different teams from across Canada who come together to write a proposal to get funding for the work. And if the funding comes through, it's usually those teams then who have the opportunities to send scientists on board, and the trip leaders will say, okay, UBC, you have 3 people that you can send, and then it would be up to me and my students to decide who from the group is going to go.
I'm continuing to monitor the chat. Please feel free if you have any questions there. I'm very curious as well. What was the most surprising thing on the first trip that you went out when you first got to go up to the Arctic?
You know, the first time I went to the Arctic, this was about, it wasn't even that long ago. I think it was in 2015, so just 6 years ago. And prior to that, I had been to the Antarctic quite a few times. And I was sort of under the false impression that the Arctic was much less mountainous than the Antarctic. And I think it's mostly because I was thinking about the western side of the Arctic, or around the Mackenzie River Delta, if you know where that is, closer over to the Yukon, which is really quite flat. But over on the eastern side of the Arctic, it's really, really mountainous. And that surprised me just because I hadn't thought about it, and I was just foolish, I guess. And I just was so blown away by the beauty and the majesty of the landscape.
If you were just dropped there not knowing where you were, is there a distinct way to know if you're in the Arctic or the Antarctic?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, there are. There's a few good ways. One of them would be to look for particular kinds of animals. And a common misconception that people have is that there are penguins in the Arctic, but there are actually no penguins in the Arctic. So if you were in a high northerly or southerly, basically a polar region, and you saw penguins, then you would know that you're in the Antarctic. You could also know, if you knew what time of the year it was. If it was June and there was full sunlight, then you would know you were in the Arctic. If it was June and it was dark all the time, you would know that you were in the southern hemisphere, and so in the Antarctic.
Question in the chat: what kind of training would a future oceanographer need after high school?
Yeah, oceanography is really a science that builds on the fundamental sciences of chemistry and biology, physics and math. So actually a lot of people don't really study oceanography even in university. They'll study biology, or they'll study chemistry or physics or math. And then typically in graduate school or in some job, then they'll learn about the applications of those things to oceanography. So just a good background in a science is important. Computing is, of course, quite important these days. So just a good general science background would allow someone to go into oceanography.
I was curious, the Siku network that you were talking about, is that something that people can access to see some of the data or the reporting?
Yes, definitely. I guess I could put up the website, but if you just look up Siku, S-I-K-U, and then maybe just to be sure, you can look up the Arctic Eider, as in the duck, Eider Society. It's all over the place. It's gained a lot of traction in recent years. I think they even won a Google Impact Award or something like this. So yes, that's publicly available for everyone. You can use a computer and you can also download it onto a smartphone.
Nice. I'm still watching for the questions. If I have missed any of your questions, please feel free to type them back in again. Sometimes things scroll quite deeply there. While I'm waiting there, another question I had for you: how do you determine what kind of research you want to do? Like, where do ideas for new experiments or projects come?
Yeah, usually every year we get some observations, and often those create new questions for us. So we'll go one year and we'll make some observations, and we might see, oh, you know, there's a lot of photosynthesis happening in this particular area, and that's interesting because there's a strong river input there. So that makes us think a little bit more about, well, where else could we sample all of these different rivers to see if this is a pattern that holds beyond this particular area. So we get ideas based on what we see. We also get ideas reading other scientific literature, where people are always coming up with new ideas, new technologies, new tools and instruments. And so we're thinking about what's going on in science and how we can apply some of these questions and some of these new tools to our particular study region.
What was your journey to become an oceanographer? Was this something you always knew you wanted to do, or how did you end up?
Yeah, you know, when I was a kid in the 1970s, there used to be all of these documentaries on television from a French marine explorer called Jacques Cousteau. I'm sure some of you will know who that is. And I was quite fascinated actually watching these things. The notion that there was this whole undersea three-dimensional world about which we knew relatively little kind of always fascinated me. So I did a degree in biology, and I sort of knew that I wanted to do marine sciences, probably since I was a pretty small kid, actually.
All right, we're getting close to the end of our time here. Have you ever had goldfish and ginger ale needed? What's your seasickness ratio?
You know, I think they say that as you get older, you get less prone to seasickness. And I think that's because your balance gets worse and your hearing gets worse. Seasickness is associated with imbalanced sensors inside your inner ear. So young people in particular tend to get really seasick. And when I was in my early 20s and I was a young graduate student, I definitely got pretty seasick. And I've had some rather unpleasant experiences for sure. I must say I'd never used goldfish, but I have used ginger ale. But now that I'm older, or getting older anyway, I find that I don't really get seasick. So there's a lot of other things that aren't so great about getting older, but seasickness is not one of them, fortunately.
Awesome. We've got a couple of late coming questions and just some great thank yous. We actually have a viewer from Alabama really appreciated the talk here today. Question here: when you're in the Arctic, is it mostly the eastern half, the western half? I guess a similar question. Is there a big difference between the two?
There is a really big difference actually between the two. There's a lot of ways to answer the question, but I'll try a few quick ones. The first is that the geography and the topography is very, very different. The eastern Arctic is very rugged, lots of glaciers. The western Arctic is much flatter, and the rivers are a lot sort of more muddier and so on. So that's a big difference. In terms of the oceanography, the Arctic on the west side has much more influence from the Pacific Ocean that's flowing from the west to the east. The eastern Arctic has a stronger imprint of Atlantic water masses that are coming through, say, Lancaster Sound, for example.
Nice. Our final question here is from a chemical engineer. They were wondering, what is the importance of the Arctic as a water resource?
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, certainly locally, there isn't, the population is so sparse there that I don't think there's any real challenge. If you're talking about the Arctic as a regional or continental source, there are certainly some large rivers that that have Arctic headwaters. And so in that respect, those rivers that are draining down to the south are very, very significant sources of fresh waters outside of the Arctic. So I do think that there are reasons to be concerned about changing hydrological cycles there. Yeah, so I think it is quite a significant resource in terms of some of these large rivers that have their headwaters and catchment in the Arctic.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Tortell.
It was a really fun way to spend a little time with you together, and hopefully you'll be able to check out some of the other resources in the Arctic Voices exhibit. I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Philippe for It was an amazing talk, and Brian for helping with the chat. And thank everyone who actually joined today, because it was the first of maybe many other presentations we'll be having at Science World.
Thanks, everybody. Great to have you all here. Have a great day.
Thank you.